The dust of the Arizona Territory doesn't just settle on things, it buries them. It buries secrets and sorrows, and sometimes it buries men. For Josephine Bishop, a widow for barely a month, the dust was a constant shroud, a gritty reminder of the grave her husband Thomas now occupied. The official story, the one whispered in Redemption Gulch's saloon and clucked over by the church ladies, was an Apache raid. A brutal, senseless attack. But stories like the desert wind can lie. And as the sun bled out over the Dragoon Mountains, a new story, a silent and terrifying one, was about to begin right on her doorstep. It wouldn't start with a war cry. It would start with a loaf of bread. The silence was the first thing that truly broke her. Not the raw, ragged grief that tore through her in the first days after they brought Thomas's body back to the homestead. That was a storm, loud and violent, but the silence that followed was a drought of the soul. It was in the empty chair across the small, rough-hewn table. It was in the still air of the barn, where his tools hung untouched, waiting for a ghost. It was in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Chihuahuan desert that had swallowed her husband whole. Josephine was a creature of the East, of green hills and gentle rain. She'd followed Thomas out to this hard-as-iron territory with a heart full of love and a head full of foolish dreams. They were going to build a life, a ranch, a future. Thomas had a partner, a man of considerable influence named Silas Kane. Kane owned the sprawling K-Bar Ranch and, it seemed, most of Redemption Gulch as well. Thomas was the water finder, the man with an almost mystical ability to read the land and know where to dig. Their partnership was meant to turn this sun-scorched earth into an empire. Then came the news. A small survey party, ambushed. Only one of Kane's ranch hands had made it back, babbling about whooping warriors and the glint of painted faces in the dawn light. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine seemed molded from tallow, organized a posse that was more for show than effect. They found Thomas and two other men 20 miles north, in a dry wash. The official verdict was swift and certain. Chiricahua Apache. The town's grief was brief, quickly curdling into a familiar simmering hatred. For Josephine, however, grief was a permanent resident. She was 26 years old, alone, and stranded on 160 acres of dirt and rock that felt more like a prison than a home. The townsfolk offered condolences that felt like accusations. A woman shouldn't be out here alone, Mrs. Gable, her nearest neighbor a mile down the road, had said, her eyes flitting around the small cabin as if assessing its value. Silas Kane had been generous. He'd paid for the funeral, stood at the graveside, a tall, imposing figure in a black coat, his face a mask of solemnity. He'd promised Josephine that Thomas's share of their future profits was secure, that he would see her right. But his eyes, the color of a faded dollar bill, held no warmth. They held calculation. He'd offered to buy her homestead, to take the burden off her hands. The price was an insult. When she refused, his generosity dried up like a summer creek. A month after the funeral, Josephine was wasting away. The pantry was nearly bare. The thought of hitching the wagon and making the trip into Redemption Gulch, of facing the pitying stares and whispered gossip, was more than she could bear. She sat on her porch, a rifle leaning against the wall beside her, and watched the world die each evening as the sun set. She was waiting, she realized, to die with it. It was on the 7th day of her self-imposed starvation, as a sliver of moon hung in the indigo sky, that she first saw him. Not a man, but a shadow detaching itself from other shadows at the edge of her property. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She fumbled for the rifle, the cold steel a shocking reality against her skin. Apache. The word screamed in her mind, a jumble of fear and the town's poison. He didn't move the way other men did. He flowed over the cracked earth, silent as a hawk's shadow. He stopped at the foot of her porch steps, a place no sane Apache would ever stand willingly. He was tall and lean, his body a tapestry of sinew and sun-darkened skin. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth. His black hair was held back by a thin leather band, and his face, stark and angular in the moonlight, was unpainted. It was his eyes that held her, dark and deep and fixed on her with an intensity that wasn't threatening, but assessing. Her hands trembled, the rifle sight wavering. He made no move for a weapon. He simply stood there. Then, slowly, he raised a hand. In it, he held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it carefully on the bottom step. Beside it, he set a U.S. Army-issue canteen. He looked at her one last time, a long, unreadable gaze, and then he was gone, melting back into the landscape from which he had emerged. She waited, her breath held until the night was silent again, save for the chirping of crickets. Hours seemed to pass. Finally, driven by a gnawing hunger that overrode her fear, she crept down the steps. The bundle was still warm. Unwrapping the cloth, her fingers found a small loaf of bread, dense and fragrant with mesquite flour. She uncapped the canteen. It was fresh milk, likely from a goat. It was a lifeline. It was a riddle. An Apache warrior, one of the people who had supposedly murdered her husband, had just saved her from starving. The first night, she convinced herself it was a fluke, a mirage born of grief and hunger. But when she awoke the next morning, the remaining half of the bread and the lingering taste of milk were undeniable proof. The cloth the bread had been wrapped in was clean, finely woven. The canteen was old but well cared for. She spent the day in a state of heightened anxiety, her eyes scanning the horizon, the rifle never far from her hand. Every rustle of the sagebrush, every shadow cast by a passing cloud sent a jolt of fear through her. As dusk settled again, she found herself on the porch, waiting. She didn't know why. Part of her expected a full-scale attack, the silent offering a prelude to violence. Another, smaller part of her felt a desperate, shameful flicker of hope. She was so very hungry. He came as he had before, a phantom in the twilight. He materialized at the edge of the scrubland and moved with that same unnerving grace. Again, he stopped at the bottom of the 3 wooden steps that led to her world. Again, he carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and the canteen. He placed them in the exact same spot. He looked up at her, his expression as unchanging as the stone buttes behind him. This time she didn't raise the rifle. She simply stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the lamplight, and watched. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and vanished. The second loaf was identical to the first. The milk was just as fresh. This became the ritual. Every evening, as the sky turned from orange to purple, he would appear. He would place the bread and milk on the bottom step. He would look at her, and then he would leave. They never spoke. The space between them, the mere 10 feet from her door to the bottom step, was a chasm of culture, history, and bloodshed. On the 4th night, a new fear took hold. What if he was being watched? The thought chilled her more than the desert night. She was consorting with the enemy, accepting aid from a savage. If Sheriff Brody, or worse, Silas Kane's men saw this, she wouldn't just be a pitiful widow. She would be a traitor. That night after he left, she scanned the darkness around her homestead for a long time, her heart pounding with a new kind of terror, one that had less to do with war cries and more to do with whispers and nooses. By the 5th night, curiosity began to war with her fear. He was not a monster. He was a man. His hands, when he set down the food, were steady and strong. His movements were deliberate, not aggressive. There was a strange dignity about him, a quiet solemnity that felt more profound than the performative grief she'd seen in town. She started to see details: a single hawk feather tied in his hair, a long faded scar that ran along his left forearm. The way his eyes seemed to notice everything, from the loose board on her porch to the way she clutched the door frame. She needed to know his name. On the 6th night, she did something different. When he appeared and placed the offerings on the step, she didn't stay in the doorway. She took one hesitant step out onto the porch. The floorboard creaked loudly in the silence. He froze, his hand still near the canteen. He looked up, his body tensed, ready to flee or fight. Josephine's voice, when it came, was a dry, rusty thing from disuse. "Wait." He did not move. He watched her, his dark eyes narrowed slightly. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. The words felt enormous, treasonous, and utterly necessary. He remained silent, but she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps. He stood there for a full minute, the tension stretching between them like a wire. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the night. That night she couldn't sleep. The exchange, as brief as it was, had changed everything. The ritual was no longer anonymous. She had acknowledged him. He had acknowledged her. The silent benefactor now had a witness. The very next day, Sheriff Brody paid her a visit. He rode up in a cloud of dust, his portly frame straining the leather of his saddle. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over her property with a proprietary air. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, tipping his hat. "Just checking in. Heard some unsettling rumors." "Rumors, Sheriff?" Josephine asked, keeping her voice steady. "Folks in town are talking," he said, his voice low. "Saying you're getting visitors at night." He stared at her hard. "Apache visitors." Josephine's blood ran cold. Mrs. Gable, she thought. The old woman's eyes missed nothing. "I'm a widow alone out here, Sheriff. My imagination plays tricks in the dark." Brody grunted, unconvinced. He gestured vaguely towards the mountains. "They're getting bold. Kane's lost a dozen head of cattle in the last 2 weeks. Blames the Chiricahua. The army's sending a patrol out from Fort Huachuca. Things are about to get ugly. If you're hiding one of them, Josephine, or taking their charity, it won't end well for you." His threat hung in the air, as sharp and ugly as a vulture's beak. He was warning her. The town's flimsy protection would be withdrawn, and she would be left to whatever fate awaited her. After he rode off, Josephine stood on the porch, the sheriff's words echoing in her ears. The world was shrinking, forcing her to choose a side. The problem was, she no longer knew which side she was on. That evening, the 7th evening, she waited with a heart full of dread and a desperate resolve. He appeared at the usual time. He walked to the step, but this time Josephine didn't wait on the porch. She walked down the steps to meet him, stopping on the step just above his. She was close enough now to see the lines etched around his eyes, to smell the scent of sage and dust that clung to him. He placed the bread and milk down, but he didn't leave. He stood there, meeting her gaze. The silence was different this time, charged with unspoken words. He was the one who broke it. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, and his English was careful, accented. "They say you are starving," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "I was," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You stopped it," he nodded. "My people do not let the widow of a friend starve." The words hit her like a physical blow. A friend? My husband Thomas? The idea was ludicrous, impossible. Thomas hated the Apache. He talked about them as thieves and savages, just like everyone else. He was a man who listened to the land, the warrior said. He did not see borders. He saw water. He was different. Before Josephine could process this, he spoke again, his eyes holding hers with that same unnerving intensity. He had fulfilled his duty, his obligation. For 7 nights he had brought her sustenance, a gesture of respect for the man he called a friend. Now the ritual was over. "I have brought you bread and milk for a week," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the still evening air. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, Josephine felt the entire world hold its breath. Then he said, "Tonight I brought my heart too, if you'll take it." The words hung between them, more shocking than a gunshot. Josephine stared at him, her mind struggling to bridge the impossible gulf his statement had created. This man, this nameless, faceless enemy who haunted the territory, was not only claiming friendship with her dead husband, but was now laying his heart at her feet. It was madness. Who are you?" she finally stammered, the question feeling small and inadequate. "My people call me Kyle," he answered. His gaze didn't waver. It was not the pleading look of a suitor, but the steady, patient gaze of a man presenting a simple, profound fact. "Kyle," she repeated, the name foreign on her tongue. "You knew my husband." "I knew Thomas Bishop," he confirmed. "We spoke many times. He came to this valley seeking water. I came seeking peace for my people. Sometimes our paths crossed. He did not draw his gun. I did not draw my bow. We talked." Josephine's world, already tilted on its axis, began to crumble. Thomas, her Thomas, consorting with an Apache. He had hidden this from her completely. Was it for her safety, or was there something else? The image of her husband, the one she had carefully preserved in the amber of her memory, began to crack. "He never told me," she said, her voice hollow. "To tell you would have been to put you in danger," Kyle said, his words showing a startling understanding of her world. "The men he rode with, the man he worked for, they do not share his heart. They see this land only for what they can take from it." Silas Kane. The name rose unbidden in Josephine's mind. A cold dread, separate from her fear of Kyle, began to seep into her bones. "What are you saying?" Kyle's eyes shifted, scanning the dark ridgeline behind her cabin before returning to her face. "It is not safe to speak here. There are always eyes in the dark." He looked at the bread and milk still sitting on the step. "This was a debt of honor. Thomas once saved my brother from a rock slide. He did not ask for reward. He asked only for silence. My bringing of food was to honor that debt, to see that his woman did not suffer." He paused and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The other, what I said, that is not a debt. That is a truth." Josephine felt dizzy, overwhelmed. I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "This is too much. The town, the sheriff, they say the Apache killed him." For the first time, a flicker of hot anger crossed Kyle's face. "The men who killed your husband were not Apache." The finality in his tone sent a shockwave through her. It wasn't a suggestion or a theory. It was a statement of fact. He was claiming to be a witness. "You know who killed him," she breathed. "I know," he said, "and they know that I know, which is why my being here puts you in even greater danger than before." He turned to leave, his duty done, his offer made. Panic seized Josephine. He was her only link to the truth. If he walked away now, she would be left alone with a half-truth that was more agonizing than ignorance. "Wait," she called out, her voice stronger now. "Don't go." Kyle stopped, his back to her. "Tell me," she pleaded. "Tell me everything, please." She took a step down, her bare feet touching the cool, dusty ground. It was a crossing of a threshold, a definitive choice. She was no longer standing on the porch of her old life. She was stepping into his world. He turned slowly to face her, the internal battle clear on his face. To tell her was to bind her to his fate, to pull her into the center of the conflict. To refuse was to leave her in a prison of lies. "The story is not for the steps of your house," he said finally. He gestured toward a small, rocky outcropping a few hundred yards from the cabin, a cluster of boulders that offered some cover from the open plains. "There, when the moon is higher." He melted into the darkness, leaving Josephine standing alone in the starlight, her heart pounding with a terrifying mixture of fear and a fierce, burning need for the truth. She looked at the cabin, her home, which now felt like a fragile, hollow shell. Then she looked towards the rocks where he had pointed. She had a choice: huddle in the safety of her lies, or walk into the dangerous dark to claim the truth. An hour later, wrapped in a shawl against the night's chill, Josephine Bishop left her home and walked towards the rocks. She did not take the rifle. She was done with the town's version of protection. She was going to hear the Apache's story. The rocks were larger up close, ancient sentinels worn smooth by centuries of wind. Kyle was waiting, blending so perfectly with the shadows that she didn't see him until he spoke. "It is a risk for you to be here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It was a risk for you to bring me food," she countered, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. She sat on a flat, cool stone, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You said Thomas was your friend. Tell me about that friendship." Kyle remained standing, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "Friend is your word. We were men who understood each other. He looked for water under the ground. I look for peace on it. Both are hard to find in this land." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "He came here often, alone. He said the land spoke to him. I told him he was one of the few white men who knew how to listen. He respected our sacred places. He would move his survey markers if they disturbed a burial ground or a spring we held holy. No other white man has ever done this." This was a Thomas she had never known. The man she'd married had been ambitious, eager to please his partner, Silas Kane, and make his fortune. This hidden side of him, a man of quiet reverence and respect, felt both alien and achingly familiar. "He told me of you," Kyle continued. "He called you his eastern flower, trying to grow in the desert. He worried for you. He did not like the town. He did not trust the man he worked for." "Silas Kane," Josephine said, the name tasting like ash. Kyle nodded. "The one you call Kane. This man's heart is poisoned with greed. He wants the land, all of it. But more than the land, he wants the water beneath it. Thomas was his key, but Thomas had a conscience." He finally crouched down, bringing himself to her level. In the faint starlight, she could see the gravity in his eyes. "Your husband found something, a great deal of water. An underground river, he called it. Enough to turn this whole valley green. It was on land the government treaty promised to my people, a section north of here that the white men called the Barren Tract." Josephine's mind raced. She remembered Thomas being excited, secretive, just before he died. He'd been poring over maps, making calculations late into the night. He told her he was on the verge of something big, something that would change everything for them. "Kane wanted this water," Kyle went on, his voice dropping lower. "He knew the government would never break the treaty for a simple rancher, but for a war. If the Apache were seen as violent, as killers breaking the peace, the army would come. They would drive us out onto reservations far from here, and the treaty land would become open land. Kane's land." A sickening realization dawned on Josephine. "He's been provoking you." "He sends his men to run off our game," Kyle confirmed. "They poison our springs. They steal our horses. Small things designed to make our young men angry. And lately, his men have been branding his cattle, then driving them onto our land and claiming we are the rustlers." The dozen head of cattle Sheriff Brody had mentioned. It was all a lie. a carefully constructed narrative to paint the Apache as villains. Thomas found out, Josephine whispered, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. That's it, isn't it? He discovered what Cain was doing. He did more than discover it, Kyle said, his voice grim. He confronted Cain. I was not there for this, but Thomas told me of it. He came to me 2 days before he was killed. He said Cain laughed at him, told him he was a fool for caring about a treaty with savages. He told Thomas that the plan was already in motion, and that he was either a part of it, or he was in the way. Kyle fell silent, letting the weight of his words settle. Josephine felt a profound, bottomless rage build within her, a rage that burned away the last vestiges of her grief, leaving something hard and sharp in its place. Her husband hadn't been the victim of a random savage attack. He had been murdered for his integrity. The day he died, she prompted, her voice tight. You said the men who killed him weren't Apache. You were there. Kyle's gaze turned distant, as if seeing the memory play out before him. Thomas sent word he needed to speak with me. He was coming north to the dry wash, under the pretense of surveying. He was bringing proof of Cain's crimes. A ledger, he said, where Cain recorded the cattle he was losing. I was watching from the ridges, waiting for him. He was not alone. 2 of Cain's men were with him, men I recognized. Their names are Jebediah Stone and Frank Miller. He spoke the names like a curse. They rode into the wash. Thomas got off his horse. He began to argue with them. I could not hear the words, but his anger was plain. One of them, Miller, the bigger one, pulled his pistol. Thomas tried to reason with him. The other one, Stone, walked behind your husband. Kyle's voice became flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of a man recounting an execution. He shot Thomas in the back of the head. Josephine made a small, choked sound, a gasp of pure horror. They shot the other 2 men as well, to make it look like a real fight. Then they did their work. They took arrows from their saddlebags, arrows they had taken from a raid on one of our empty hunting camps weeks before, and shot the bodies. They used their knives on them to make it look like the work of my people. It was a lie painted in her husband's blood. He had seen it all. He had watched her husband die, and had been powerless to stop it without revealing himself and starting the very war Cain wanted. Josephine began to tremble, not from cold, but from a fury so potent it threatened to consume her. The story the town had fed her, the story she had wept over, the story Silas Cain had told with his sad eyes and solemn face, was a monstrous fabrication. Thomas wasn't just dead. He had been erased, his murder used as a political tool by the man he called his partner. The ledger, she asked, her voice shaking with rage. Did they find it? Kyle shook his head. No. I saw them search his saddlebags, his coat. They found nothing. They grew angry, frustrated. They left him there for the buzzards. I waited until they were gone, and I went down. I covered his body with stones to protect it. It is how I knew where the posse would find him. I left a sign. He had not only witnessed the murder, he had given her husband a temporary grave, an act of final respect. This warrior, this savage, had shown more humanity than anyone in Redemption Gulch. She looked at Kyle, truly looked at him, and saw not an enemy, but the sole keeper of her husband's honor. He had carried this horrific secret, this burden for weeks. He had watched over her, the widow of the man he couldn't save, and had honored his debt. And then he had offered her his heart. She understood now. It wasn't a sudden romantic whim. It was an offer of alliance, of protection, a bond forged in a terrible shared truth. He was offering to stand with her against the man who had destroyed both their worlds. What do we do? She asked, and the word we felt as natural as breathing. Kyle's eyes met hers in the darkness. Cain does not know what Thomas told me, he said. But he knows I was in the area. He suspects. And now that Brody has seen you are not starving, now that the town whispers of an Apache visitor, Kane will put the pieces together. He will know you have been told the truth, and he will not allow a witness to live. The implication was terrifyingly clear. Silas Kane was coming for her. He will come for you, Kyle finished, his voice a low, urgent warning. And he will come soon. The walk back to the cabin was a journey to a different world. The familiar structure of her home, once a sanctuary of memory, now seemed like a fragile trap. Every shadow was a threat, every creak of a floorboard a prelude to violence. The truth Kyle had given her was a heavy, dangerous stone in her pocket, and she could feel its weight dragging her down into the dark. She didn't sleep. She sat at the small table where she had once shared meals with Thomas, the ledger he'd died for now, a phantom between them. Where was it? He must have hidden it. He was clever, meticulous. He wouldn't have ridden to that meeting without a plan. She searched the cabin, her hands frantic. She looked through his books, his papers, the small wooden chest where he kept his personal effects. Nothing. She searched the barn, the tack room, the small shed where he repaired his tools. Still nothing. The ledger, the only tangible proof of Kane's villainy, was gone. The next day dawned blood-red and ominous. The air was still and heavy, carrying a tension that felt electric. Josephine forced herself to move, to act. She couldn't be a sitting duck. She brought water in from the well, bolted the shutters on the windows, and placed her rifle, cleaned and loaded, on the table. It felt pitifully inadequate. Mid-morning, she saw a rider approaching. It wasn't the slow, plodding gait of Sheriff Brody's horse. This rider was fast, purposeful. It was Silas Kane. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was as imposing as its owner. He dismounted and strode to her porch, his silver spurs jingling with each step. He removed his hat, revealing a full head of iron-gray hair. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way. "Josephine," he said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "I was worried. I heard the sheriff's report. Rumors of you being unwell and associating with undesirables." "I'm managing, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice tight. She did not invite him in. His smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "That's good to hear, but this is no place for a lady alone. The Apache situation is escalating. I'm losing cattle every day. It's only a matter of time before they get bolder, before they come for more than just livestock." He let the threat hang in the air. "I've come to repeat my offer. I'll buy this homestead, give you a fair price. Enough to get you back east, back to civilization where you belong." "And if I refuse?" she asked, her hand instinctively inching towards the doorframe, closer to the rifle inside. Kane's smile vanished. "Then I can't guarantee your safety. Sheriff Brody is a good man, but he's one man. The army is busy. When the Chiricahua decide they want this land, this spring, they will take it, and they will kill anyone standing on it." It was a threat wrapped in a warning. He was telling her what he was going to do, attributing his own future actions to the Apache. He was testing her, trying to see what she knew. "My husband died for this land," Josephine said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "He believed in it. I'm not leaving." Kane's eyes narrowed. He had seen the defiance in her, the shift from a grieving widow to something else, something harder. "That's a foolish choice, Josephine. Thomas was a fool too in the end. He had his head in the clouds and his feet in the wrong patch of dirt." He put his hat back on, his movements sharp and deliberate. "I'll give you until sundown to reconsider, for Thomas's sake." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Josephine with a certainty as cold and hard as a tombstone. Sundown was a deadline. The afternoon crawled by, each minute thick with dread. She kept looking to the ridges, hoping for a sign of Kyle, but the landscape remained empty. impassive. Was he out there? Did he know Cain had come? The loneliness was a physical presence now, a hand squeezing her heart. She went back to the barn, her mind racing. Where would Thomas hide something so important? He loved puzzles, patterns. He thought in terms of the land. He always said, "People forget to look down." She scanned the dirt floor of the barn. It was packed hard, uneven, but near the back, under a pile of old burlap sacks, was a single loose flagstone. It was out of place, different from the surrounding earth. Her fingers trembled as she pried at its edges. It was heavy, but it lifted. Beneath it was a small hollowed-out space, and inside that space, wrapped in oilskin, was a thin, leather-bound ledger. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened it. Thomas's neat, precise script filled the pages. It was all there. Dates, cattle numbers, brands altered, and notes in the margins detailing conversations with Cain, documenting his growing suspicions and Cain's increasingly brazen lies. The final entry was dated the morning of his death. It read, "Cain plans to use the Barren Tract Treaty to start a war. He means to kill the Apache, and God help anyone who stands in his way. I'm taking this to the Chiricahua, a man named Kyle. He is a man of honor. He will know what to do." Tears streamed down Josephine's face. Tears of sorrow, of pride, of vindication. Her husband had been a hero, not a fool. He had died trying to prevent a genocide, trying to do the right thing in a world gone wrong. A sharp crack echoed from the direction of the house, the sound of splintering wood. She looked out the barn door. 2 men on horseback were at her cabin, Jebediah Stone and Frank Miller. They had just kicked in her front door. They weren't waiting for sundown. Josephine's blood ran cold. She was trapped in the barn, the ledger in her hands. They would search the house, and when they didn't find her, they would come here. She looked around desperately. Her only exit was the main barn door, directly in their line of sight. She heard their voices, rough and angry, coming from the house. "She ain't here," one shouted. "Check the barn." Panic gave way to a cold, clear resolve. She would not let them get this ledger. She would not let Thomas's sacrifice be for nothing. She looked up at the hayloft. A thick rope used for hauling hay bales dangled down. Above the loft was a small opening, a window for ventilation that looked out over the back of the property, towards the rocky hills. It was her only chance. Clutching the ledger, she scrambled up the ladder to the loft, just as the barn doors groaned open. She pressed herself flat behind a pile of hay, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Look around," Miller's voice boomed from below. "Cain wants her found, and he wants what she's got." Josephine could hear them moving, kicking over buckets, tossing aside tools. She risked a peek. Miller was directly below the loft. Stone was searching the tack room. She had seconds. Holding the ledger tight to her chest, she crawled to the back of the loft. The rope. She had one chance. With a silent prayer, she wrapped her legs around the rope, took a deep breath, and swung. She sailed through the air, out the open hayloft door, a desperate flying shadow. She let go, landing hard in the dusty corral behind the barn, the impact jarring her to the bone. A shout went up from inside. "There she goes!" She didn't look back. She scrambled to her feet and ran. She ran for the rocks, for the hills, for the wilderness that had once terrified her, but now represented her only hope of survival. Behind her, she heard the thunder of hooves as Stone and Miller mounted their horses. The hunt had begun. The desert that Josephine had once seen as a barren wasteland now became her only ally. She ran, her lungs burning, her feet finding purchase on rocks and in sand she'd never noticed before. The terrain was her shield. She scrambled up a steep embankment, her nails digging into the dry soil. the ledger tucked securely inside her blouse. The shouts of the men behind her grew louder, punctuated by the whinny of their horses. They were faster, but she was smaller, more nimble. She could go where the horses couldn't. She reached the cluster of boulders where she had met Kyle. It was a natural fortress of stone, a maze of narrow passages and shadowy overhangs. She ducked into a tight crevice between two massive rocks, pressing herself into the narrow space, panting for breath. She could hear the horses circling the perimeter of the rock pile, the men cursing in frustration. "She's in here somewhere," Miller's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Flush her out." A gunshot rang out, and a bullet ricocheted off the rock just above her head, sending stone chips raining down. They were shooting blind, hoping to get lucky or frighten her out of her hiding place. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she clutched the rock face. This was it. This was how she would die, cornered like an animal. Then she heard a sound that was not a gunshot, not a man's voice, not a horse. It was a low, piercing whistle, like the cry of a hawk. It came from high up, from the top of the tallest boulder. "What was that?" Stone asked, his voice laced with unease. "Just a bird, you idiot," Miller snapped. "Find her." Another whistle, closer this time. Then, from the rocks above them, a figure rose. It was Kyle. He stood for a moment against the deep blue sky, an arrow nocked in his bow. He was the hawk. "Leave this place," Kyle's voice boomed, amplified by the rocks. "This is not your land." "It's the Apache," Stone yelled, a note of real fear in his voice. He raised his rifle and fired. But Kyle was gone, having dropped back behind the rocks an instant before the shot. The bullet whined harmlessly into the sky. "He's one man," Miller roared. "Get him! I'll get the woman!" The battle began. It was not a battle of volleys and charges, but one of shadows and cunning. Kyle moved through the rocks like a spirit, a silent, deadly force. An arrow whispered from a crevice and embedded itself in the leather of Stone's saddle, making his horse rear and scream in terror. Another arrow shattered the stock of Miller's rifle as he tried to take aim at a shadow. Josephine used the chaos to her advantage. While the men were distracted, she scurried from her hiding place, moving deeper into the rocky labyrinth. She knew she was the bait. As long as they were hunting her, Kyle could hunt them. She found a high ledge that gave her a vantage point. She could see Miller on foot, moving cautiously through the passages below, his pistol drawn. Stone was trying to calm his horse further down the slope. And Kyle was nowhere and everywhere. She saw a flicker of movement on a ridge to her left, then a pebble skitter down a rock face to her right. He was playing with them, using the terrain as his weapon, herding them. Miller was getting closer to her position. He was a large, brutish man, his face red with exertion and fury. "Come on out, little lady," he called, his voice a gravelly taunt. "Mr. Kane just wants to talk." Josephine's heart hammered. She was out of places to run. She was cornered on the ledge. Below her was a 20-foot drop. She looked around, desperate. Her eyes landed on a large, precariously balanced rock at the edge of the ledge, loosened by erosion. It was perhaps the size of a travel trunk. Miller was now directly below her, his back to the cliff face. As he scanned the passages ahead, Josephine put her shoulder to the loose rock. It budged. She pushed again, her muscles screaming in protest. It shifted, grinding against the ledge. Miller heard the sound and looked up. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw her, a wild-haired apparition of vengeance straining against the massive boulder. He raised his pistol, but it was too late. With a final, desperate heave, Josephine sent the rock tumbling over the edge. It fell with a sickening crunch, striking Miller's shoulder and pinning him against the canyon wall. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the bone snapped and his pistol clattered to the ground. He was trapped, disabled. At the same moment, a cry of alarm came from the slope below. Stone, finally having calmed his horse, had turned just in time to see Kyle drop from a ledge behind him. The fight was short and brutal. Kyle moved with a fluid, lethal grace, disarming Stone and delivering a blow that sent the man crumpling to the ground unconscious. Silence descended upon the rocks, broken only by Miller's pained groans. Kyle appeared at the base of Josephine's ledge as if from nowhere. He looked up at her, his face grim, but his eyes full of a fierce admiration. Then he looked at the pinned and whimpering Frank Miller. "He will not die," Kyle said, "but he will not be riding anywhere for a long time." Josephine scrambled down from the ledge, her body shaking with adrenaline. She stood before Kyle, covered in dust, her hair wild, the precious ledger still safe. They had won. They had survived. She pulled the ledger from her blouse and held it out. "I found it," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thomas's proof." Kyle took it, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was warm, steady. He looked from the book to her face. "You fought like a lioness for your mate's honor," he said softly. "They made me a widow," Josephine replied, her voice hard as steel. "Today, I made sure they knew what that meant." The sound of approaching horses suddenly broke the stillness. Not 2 horses, but many. A posse. Josephine's blood ran cold. It had to be Sheriff Brody, likely alerted by Kane. "They will see him," she said, nodding towards the unconscious Stone. "They will see Miller. They will see you. They will only see one story: a savage Apache attacking white men." Kyle's face was calm. "Go to them," he said, pressing the ledger back into her hands. "Give them this. Tell them the truth. Your voice, the voice of Thomas Bishop's widow, will carry more weight than my arrows." "And you?" she asked, her heart seizing with fear for him. "They will hunt you down." "I will not be found," he said with absolute certainty. "But I will be watching." He touched her arm gently. "Be strong, Josephine Bishop. Your war is not over. It has just moved from the rocks to the town." He gave her one last, long look, a look that conveyed 1,000 unspoken words, and then he vanished back into the landscape, becoming one with the shadows, just as Sheriff Brody and a dozen armed men from Redemption Gulch crested the nearby hill. Josephine stood her ground, the ledger clutched in her hand, ready to face them. Sheriff Brody reined in his horse, his face a mixture of shock and suspicion. He and his posse stared at the scene before them. Josephine Bishop, disheveled and defiant. Frank Miller, one of Kane's top men, pinned by a boulder and moaning in agony. And Jebediah Stone, unconscious on the ground. There were Apache arrows in the dirt, but there was no Apache. "Mrs. Bishop," Brody blustered, dismounting clumsily. "What in God's name happened here?" "Justice happened, Sheriff," Josephine said, her voice clear and ringing with authority. She held up the ledger. "These men were sent by Silas Kane to kill me and retrieve this. It's my husband's journal. It proves that Kane murdered him and 2 other men, and that he framed the Apache to start a war over treaty land." A murmur went through the posse. These were townspeople, ranchers, men who knew and respected Thomas Bishop. They also knew Silas Kane's reputation for ruthlessness. "That's a mighty serious accusation, ma'am," Brody said, his eyes shifting nervously from Josephine to the incapacitated men. "Read it," Josephine challenged, walking forward and thrusting the book at him. "Read my husband's last words. He named his killer. And these 2, she gestured with contempt at Miller and Stone, are the men who pulled the triggers. I'm sure Mr. Miller here will be happy to confess everything in exchange for a doctor." Brody took the ledger, his face pale. He opened it and began to read. As he turned the pages, the color drained completely from his face. He was a weak man, a cowardly man, but he was not a stupid one. He knew the difference between a widow's hysteria and cold, hard proof in the victim's own hand. The tide of opinion in Redemption Gulch turned with the swift, terrible force of a flash flood. Armed with the ledger, Josephine's testimony, and a groaning confession from Frank Miller, Sheriff Brody had no choice but to act. He rode out to the K-Bar Ranch, this time with a posse that was not for show, and arrested Silas Kane. The truth, once revealed, was like a cleansing fire. It burned away the lies and the fear that had poisoned the town. People looked at Josephine differently now, not with pity, but with a grudging respect. She was no longer just Thomas Bishop's widow. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Kane and won. But for Josephine, the victory was hollow. The town was still the town. The stairs had changed, but they were still stairs. She had exposed the truth, but she had also exposed the ugly fault lines of hatred and greed that ran just beneath the surface. She did not belong here. Her home was a place of ghosts, her future a blank, dusty page. A week after Kane's arrest, she packed a few belongings in a wagon. She sold the homestead to a young family passing through, asking only enough to get her started somewhere new. She didn't know where she was going. Maybe north to Oregon, a place she'd heard was green and forgiving. On her last evening, she stood on the porch of the cabin one last time and looked out at the desert. She thought of the 7 nights he had come, a silent guardian, bringing bread and milk. She thought of his impossible, heartfelt offer. She had not seen him since the battle in the rocks, but she felt his presence, a watchful peace on the edge of her world. As if summoned by her thoughts, he emerged from the twilight. Kyle walked not to the steps, but directly to her, stopping just before her on the dusty ground. He looked at her packed wagon, his expression unreadable. "You are leaving?" he stated. "There is nothing for me here," she replied softly. "My husband's name is cleared. The truth is known, but this is not my home anymore." "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Somewhere new, somewhere the dust doesn't hold so many secrets." They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them filled with the future they could not have. He was of the desert, and she was a traveler passing through. The chasm between their worlds, she feared, was simply too wide to cross. Kyle looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a profound sadness. "What I offered you on that 7th night, the truth of my heart, it has not changed." Josephine's own heart ached. She thought of a life of loneliness in a new town, of being forever the brave widow from Arizona. Then she thought of this man, his honor, his courage, his quiet strength. He had brought her truth. He had brought her justice. He had brought her back to life. "The world won't accept us, Kyle," she whispered, the words tasting like defeat. "There is no place for a white woman and an Apache warrior." "Then we will make a place," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled her. He took a step closer, his presence commanding. "I am not asking you to live in my world, and you cannot ask me to live in yours. I'm asking you to build a new one with me, far from here. There are valleys to the north, hidden and safe, where the earth is good, and men like Cain have not yet spoiled it. A place where a home is built, not of wood and nails, but of respect. A place where our children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the truth in their hearts." He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His touch was not rough, but gentle, reverent. "You said you are going somewhere new. Do not go alone. Come with me, Josephine." In his eyes she did not see a warrior or a savage or any of the labels his world or hers would put on him. She saw a man, a good, honorable man who had seen the worst of her world, and still had the courage to offer the best of himself. He had brought her bread and milk to feed her body. He had brought her the truth to feed her soul. And now he was offering her a future to feed her heart. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of a vast and overwhelming hope. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise that sealed their impossible pact. "Yes, I will." They left at dawn, her simple wagon following his lone horse. They rode not east or west towards the settled lands or the untamed territories, but north towards a shared horizon, a blank page on a map where they would write their own story. It would not be an easy life, but it would be theirs. Together, they rode away from the silence of the dust and towards the promise of a life lived in truth. The story of Josephine Bishop and the Apache warrior Kyle is a testament to a truth the Wild West often tried to bury: that courage isn't about how fast you can draw a gun, but how bravely you can open your heart. In a world determined to build walls of hatred and fear, they chose to build a bridge of understanding, forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal. Theirs is a story that reminds us that heroes are not always the ones with shiny badges, but are sometimes the quiet guardians who appear in our darkest hours, offering not just sustenance, but salvation. They prove that even in the harshest of landscapes, the most unlikely seeds of love and respect can take root and bloom. If their incredible journey from suspicion to salvation moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit and unexpected love. And most importantly, if you want more stories that bring the forgotten voices of the past to life, don't forget to subscribe.